Hey, everybody. This is Nevin Gusak, your host of the Populist Patriot. With me is a very special guest, Alan Hahn. Alan Hahn is the founder of a Facebook political group known as the National Democracy Party. It is still active on Facebook. He is one of the administrators of that particular organization. It is a clearinghouse for news articles related on the threats of China and Russia, as well as the economic decline of the United States as a result of trickle-down economics, Reaganism or Reaganomics, globalization, and labor arbitrage through exploitation of undocumented and documented immigrants, outsourcing, and union busting. Alan hails from Michigan, where his parents, I believe, worked in the American automobile industry back in its heyday. Alan has seen firsthand the devastation of free trade and poorly controlled imports, as well as the shareholder-driven Milton Friedman version of capitalism. Alan is going to provide some background on his political evolution. He was on the show once before last year in 2021, and quite a bit has transpired since 2021. So Alan's going to discuss political evolution. He's going to give his unique commentary on the election and also a report card on the Trump administration, as well as also the status of the threats of Russia and China and domestic political extremists of the left, as well as neo-fascists. Welcome back, Alan. It's great to have you.
Thanks, Nevin. It's good to be back. Yeah, so basically you hit the nail on the head. I was born in the suburbs of Detroit in the 80s, so I grew up there, in the 80s, the 90s, and the early 2000s. Actually, my dad did work in an automobile plant for GM before I was born. When I was a kid, he worked selling advertising for what used to be called Thomas Register. They were the big green books that manufacturers used to advertise their products, right? When there were manufacturers to have advertising, right? So
yes, indeed.
So, that's my story. Is I saw what you could have when you had a strong labor movement and you had, industrial jobs in America. And I also watched it get flushed down the toilet, especially in the early 2000s after NAFTA and WTO basically took all the jobs and shifted them first to Mexico and then to China, right? So when I finished school, I ended up having to move to Arizona to find a job because there just weren't jobs in Metro Detroit anymore. So I basically grew up as a labor Democrat, right? So, more of a center-leaning, what they would have called, Reagan Democrats in the 80s, kind of center-leaning with strong labor economic policies. So, fair wage for a fair day's labor kind of a deal. In the late 2000s, around 2010, during the Obama administration, I lost, my faith in the Democratic Party as I didn't feel like it represented my views anymore. It had shifted more into a anti-American foreign policy, so blame America first foreign policy. It no longer seemed to be focused on the needs of workers, which I would come to learn really dated back all the way to the Clinton administration and the signing of NAFTA and the WTO during the Clinton years. And so it no longer felt like somewhere I wanted to be, but at the same time, socially, I didn't really agree with the extreme positions of the Republican Party. I had a lot of agreement with their proclaimed national security positions, which they didn't really back up with actions. And I certainly didn't agree with their economic policies, especially after the midterm elections of 2010, where it all just became about, quote unquote, job creators and tax cuts and spending cuts, and government so small you can drown it in a bathtub, to quote, what, Grover Norquist. So,
Correct.
yeah, that was really kind of my breaking point, was like, okay, neither party represents what I believe in. I cannot be the only one. So I went onto Facebook and I decided to try to start a political party, because why not? I still would say it's what this country needs, is a third political party, because the two big tent parties that we have don't work, right? They do not represent the interests of regular, ordinary Americans. They represent extremists who just get more extreme in every election, and the American people have nowhere to turn. So that's, I have to put a shout out to Sean Ng in New York. He's helping a lot to keep the site going, because it can't all just be me. So I have found people who agree with me, which has been nice, like you, Nevin.
Well, yeah, and one of the reasons why I decided to get involved in the process is, look, to get my voice out there. Why not do it the old-fashioned American way and create my own YouTube show, which I did with my co-host Herschel Miller, who is also of like mind of us. I know you've interacted with Herschel before. And, this program is now going to be almost 2 years old, if you could believe it. We're getting to that point. We've had a lot of great guests, dissident elements of the right and left, which is nice, who agree with us on certain points, some more than others, depending on the issue. And with me, as many in the audience know from my writings, my interviews on other programs, and my broadcasts on this show, I never was fully enamored with the so-called anti-war left, because they seem to, under the guise of, quote, anti-imperialism, champion our enemies or downplay their hostile intentions towards the United States, or justify or minimize their massive human rights violations. So I never could really fully embrace elements of the political left in this country. And then when it came, I was always an adherent of the right until about 2008, when I started to really question things. Um, and it's a very long story, but my concern with the so-called conservatives is the only things ever since the Reagan, I term it the Reagan counter-revolution, since the early 1980s, really even stretching even under the Democratic presidential administration of Jimmy Carter, who deregulated the airlines. He started to deregulate the Buy America laws, and he also deregulated trucking too as well. And he was also more austerity minded compared to labor Democrats like former Senator Scoop Jackson of Washington State. With the right, they like to grouse and complain and proclaim their opposition to socialist and communism and their dictatorships. But you mentioned the name Grover Norquist, who's a perfect example. They're really hypocrites.
Mm-hmm.
Americans for Tax Reform, when you look at Grover Norquist's record, Grover Norquist's Americans for Tax Reform championed lifting the already porous embargo on communist Cuba. I've documented that. And he also, Americans for Tax Reform, actually championed openly and lobbied for permanent normal trade relations for Red Communist China and the KGB thug dictatorship of Putin's Russia. And in fact, in one ATR correspondence, Norquist and the Americans for Tax Reform threatened to penalize congressmen and senators who voted against PNTR, who were for China. So when we take a look at this, this is the kind of hypocrisy. And when I started to listen and, to different populist radio broadcasters of the left and right, and when I started to really do a deep dive and research why these so-called conservatives and libertarians, many of them were championing trade and liberalization of relations with Russia and China, Cuba, in some cases Vietnam, etc., they came to the conclusion much of it is driven by ideology and this greed is good worldview and really donor-driven political activism. Donor-driven, I mean driven by
Yeah.
wealthy, super wealthy globalists. And it's not a conspiracy, of course, as the John Birchers used to mention. It's more of this is their worldview. These are people that are culturally disconnected to America. Many have commented on it. Many of these super wealthy people openly say it, as I've documented, and many others have documented. And there's also the phenomenon of corporate sociopathy. They literally don't care. There is something missing in them, in their soul, where they don't care who they hurt when making business decisions. Perfect example of what the massive investor and Republican donor Paul Singer did to Cavalas, to Sidney, Nebraska. If you need any reminding, or what that the crypto guy, the FTX guy,
Yeah.
what was leaked in his DMs, basically saying, yeah, he talked about doing the right thing by his customers and his business, and he talked a big game about ethics, but it was just window dressing, as he admitted. And there was a good episode on the Young Turks with Anna Kasparian, who actually talked about that and did a deep dive of that in detail. So when I looked at that, I said to myself, you know, Karl Marx had a point when he said in the Communist Manifesto that the bourgeoisie are their own gravediggers, and he's right. Now, the purpose of this program is to avoid a Marxist or neo-fascist takeover, but we need fundamental alterations to our political structure to a degree to add on to the Constitution. And I think the critical existential question in American politics is how can we configure a system that can truly enact checks and balances against the private sector oligarchs. So tell me more about, and that's why I abandoned so-called conservatism, because the only institution they want to conserve is the aggregated wealth and power, political power of the private sector oligarchs. Everything else is window dressing, essentially, or campaign sloganeering. So moving forward, now, Donald J. Trump came to the fore. And I remember commenting on the National Democracy Party's internal discussion group that we were part of. There were some very bitter fights that developed.
Oh, yeah.
I thought that I was one individual who supported Trump because Trump had a verbal history and even a written history of being a sort of radical centrist, very similar to what you and I are.
Mm-hmm.
And I supported him. Now, of course, I fell out of favor. My last book, I have a chapter in volume 2 called Trump Revolution Betrayed. That gives you my thought on the Trump administration. And I withdrew support early on in 2017 when it became very clear that he was going to be Reagan 2.0 in most areas. How did you feel about Trump? And how did that affect the National Democracy Party, if at all? And did you support Trump? Did you not support him? What did you think of Bernie, Hillary, the other Republican candidates?
So Trump was a train wreck for the National Democracy Party. So any effort I had made in the years leading up to 2016 to try to find allies and like-minded individuals on the right and the left, because that's the reality of the situation is they're disenfranchised Americans, both in the Democratic Party and in the Republican Party. People who are part of these big tent parties because they believe that they should be able to earn a living wage, or America needs to focus on its national defense, and who are otherwise completely unrepresented by those parties, right? And so I had sought out people on both sides in an effort to build a coalition for a new movement. Unfortunately, Donald Trump, the one thing he was very good at was being polarizing. Okay? that was it. You either loved him or you hated him. And so that was the problem. The people who came from the right loved him. The people who came from the left hated him. And there was no compromise. There was no in between. There's no like, okay, maybe he's okay. It was just love him or hate him. Now, personally, I voted for him in 2016. I certainly could not have voted for Hillary Clinton because, like I said, it was her husband, Bill Clinton, who sold us out. It just would have been more of the same of shipping jobs out and getting rich while the American people lost, right? So he also said a lot of things that I thought finally needed to be said about our trade relationships with China and rebalancing our trade situation, which was something that Bernie Sanders had said before. And before the 2016 election, I was pretty supportive of Sanders, but I felt like somewhat in the 2016 election and especially in the 2020 election, he had given up too much to the progressive left and abandoned too much of the economic populism of the left, right? So it was because that's where the Democratic Party is. If you want to win a Democratic Party primary, you're not running on raising wages and bringing back union jobs. You're running on the politics of division, and you're running on, climate crisis. That's what you're running on. There's nothing else you can run on and win in a Democratic primary, at least for president, right? So that's what he was running on. So yeah, in 2016, I supported Trump. And so I was surprised when he got elected. It was, I think, a surprise to everybody. But I think I was more surprised by his, like you said, almost immediate turnabout. Okay. So a lot of it was his own fault in that he had no base of support in the Republican Party for his positions, because those are not the positions of the Republican Party. So he had alienated the Democrats just by winning. And so he had only to rely on the Republicans, who were going to pull him into what they believed should be done. So the perfect example is the Trump tax cuts that he touted as, trying to cut taxes on the middle class, and was hijacked by Pat Toomey into billion-dollar giveaways for the uber rich, right? So part of it was he had no base of support. Part of it was he's a narcissist and an egomaniac, and who would give anything to anybody who said a good word about him. So, and at the same time, like you said, I'm more of a centrist on social issues, and to watch him go further and further to the right on social issues was also alienating, right? So it was no longer what I had thought I was voting for in 2016 with somebody who could, piss off the Republicans by not being far enough to the right and could do what the American people needed. He had just become another Republican who was just louder. You're right?
Yeah. No, I think that's a reasonable analysis. I would add that Trump is also malleable too. With the Trump tax cut, he actually, according to Senator Sherrod Brown, one of the few good labor-oriented Democrats, he's from Ohio, and Brown recollected that Trump was actually supportive of his proposals for the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017 that would have been pro-American manufacturing as well as pro-American high-wage labor. And Trump said he supported it. But then the Chamber of Commerce, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, Mitch McConnell, the sort of, your Tea Party, globalist, corporate libertarians, corporate free market types, that are in Conservative Incorporated, they got to him and they gave him a song and dance. And there were some people in Conservative Incorporated, like the ALEC, American Legislative Exchange Council, Freda Katz, I believe her name. And she said in an interview that, Trump is a blank slate. There were two of them that said this in Conservative Incorporated. One of them, I think her name was Freda Katz of ALEC. And she said Trump is a blank slate, and this is an opportunity where we can get, quote, the free market agenda, code speak for let's shit all over American national security and
Mm-hmm.
shit all over the American worker, shit all over American independent business, and shit over the poor. That's what free market means, by the way, audience. I
Oh,
mean,
of course.
I know a quarter of you right
Yeah.
wingers are going to get pissed off, the Reaganites, but I've told you a million times, guys in the audience, I'm not a Reaganite. I'm not a Marxist Leninist. And for God's sakes, I'm not a neo fascist, okay? Let's just get that out there. Anyway, so that's the other part that I would add, that Trump is a blank slate. And they took advantage of that. The political establishment of the so-called American right and corporate America took advantage of that. And Trump did not build a real political movement where it was his own unique brand codified in a platform with his own handpicked leaders who are ideologically akin to his stated ideas. And I voted for Trump in 2016 as well. I did not vote for him in 2020. Um, because by then most of his presidency was a train wreck. There were some good things he did. He did bring in some very good people like Peter Navarro and Robert Lighthizer. And as Peter Navarro has mentioned in his latest book, and I encourage people to purchase it and read it, it really goes into how the, quote, Trump agenda was subverted by the Tea Party and the Republican establishment. And I'm on this show, by the way, I'm very anti-Tea Party. On this show,
Good.
this bar, our liquor is anti-Tea Party. We don't like Tea Party economics. Most of the Tea Party, by the way, ladies and gentlemen in the audience, voted for permanent normal trade relations with frickin' Vladimir in Ukraine invading Putin. So they do it because they're loyal to ideology of free trade and because they get money from the Koch brothers and big oil and all these other corporations that have invested tremendously with our enemies. And that is intolerable. So anyways, so basically, as Peter Navarro revealed, people like the Larry Kudlows, the Gary Cohns, the Mitch McConnells, the Paul Ryans, in many areas, they subverted the Trump agenda. And I like Trump because he didn't take a dogmatic view towards issues like the social issues, like the economy. He brought for the first time trade, our failed free trade policies, as an issue. He ran against the Republican opponents like Ted Cruz and others. And he talked about, yes, things that were in horrible taste, like about commenting about Ted Cruz's father and Ted Cruz's wife, which was totally inappropriate and out of bounds. But he also mentioned things about Jeb Bush and Ted Cruz as being puppets of donors like that on Wall Street. And I think that was needed to be said. And Trump said the right things about massive upgrades to elements of our infrastructure. He talked about American manufacturing. He was not ideological about Planned Parenthood. And he said, other than, the abortion issue, Planned Parenthood does a lot of good things for women, such as, gynecological checkups and breast checkups and things of that nature. So I really liked, finally, we had somebody who was not ideologically so far left, they're ready to fall off into the Pacific Ocean from the left coast in California. And they weren't, he wasn't like this, paid whore for the Koch brothers and Exxon Mobil and Goldman Sachs.
Yep.
So, and that he was independently wealthy so he can self-fund, or at least on the surface self-fund part of his campaign, and he didn't owe anybody. So, right. And he even had some hints of campaign finance reform and universal health care, which would combine capitalistic medicine with that of a national health insurance program. So I really liked his non-ideological approach. For example, in 1999, Trump said in an interview, he's like, the left doesn't get it quite right and the right doesn't get it quite right for the American people. And that's what I think I really wanted. So I was very angry at Trump for betraying the Trump brand, what he touted in his own ham-handed, ham-fisted way.
Yeah.
And I went back to being politically homeless. There were some people on my Facebook that were pissed at my posts. And one guy who is a local conservative radio host, Dick Farrell, said, well, if you're against Trump, you're against me, and I can't be friends with you. Now, Dick Farrell sadly passed away from COVID because he was a vaccine skeptic, and he refused to get the vaccine until he was in his deathbed. And when he was on his deathbed, he said, if there's anything I can tell you, last words, get the vaccine. I'm not saying vaccines don't have issues. I am partially a vaccine skeptic, but I think one of the unfortunate consequences of, quote, Trumpism was it furthered division in this country. Yeah. And it hijacked and really brought out the worst impulses in American politics, because the things that we were divided on was very dangerous for the national fabric, which leads me to COVID. Now, in my opinion, the Trump policy towards COVID, people like Mick the Dick Mulvaney and Larry Kudlow and others were basically, amongst others, and even in some ways Dr. Fauci, but particularly a lot of the conservative incorporated people in the Trump administration and Congress, including Nancy Pelosi, who put the income caps on the COVID relief. I mean, $100,000 in New York City or $200,000 in New York City or Washington, D.C. or Boston is just getting by. And Nancy Pelosi was on the corporate right. She teabagged, meaning Tea Party. I have no respect for Tea Party austerity people. I'm sorry, guys, on the show. You can unfriend me or unsubscribe. I'm going to say it 1,000 times. I don't identify with them. So, Nancy Pelosi and Mitch McConnell and most of the Republicans and a quarter of the corporate Democrats, they were full-blown austerity. Well, they dumped PPP loans into American corporations, and the Trump administration, people like Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin, refused to disclose at first who got the loans and have any accountability. But meanwhile, they were quibbling about, $1,200 and weekly unemployment is $600. Oh my God, we got to debate this for 10 years and American people are starving and American small businesses are getting destroyed. And I mean, I'm of the opinion that communists try to use that as an intentional or unintentional biological warfare program. That's a controversial point. And meanwhile, this country was so divided. You look at the Communist Party USA and DSA, Democratic Socialists of America Press, they're recruiting members like gangbusters because our system is failing the American people. So the extremist groups getting bigger and bigger and bigger. I mean, DSA, we're talking 80,000 people. That's a lot. So, Alan Hahn, what the hell happened with COVID in your opinion?
So, we'll never know where it came from. Right. The Chinese will claim that it was, something to do with wildlife till they're blue in the face. They'll shut down any WHO investigation into any other theory that we'll never know where it came from. And there's no reason to debate it. It doesn't matter. Right. They absolutely took advantage of the situation. Right. They absolutely saw the chaos that it created and tried to expand into a vacuum, right? Because that's who the Chinese Communist Party is, right? They definitely tried to take advantage of the situation. Now, at home, yes, our divisions absolutely played a part in the failure. We had, right at the very beginning, we had Donald Trump saying, well, we need to stop travel from China. And we had Nancy Pelosi saying, he's a xenophobe. He's trying to close the border to China. It's like,
right.
Wait.
Trump was correct on that, by the way.
He absolutely was correct.
He was correct. And Peter Navarro wanted that too. And the corporate people, I'm sorry to interrupt, in the Trump administration did not want that.
Right. But it's what needed to happen.
Of course.
of course, the Democrats just thought, oh, well, here's a chance to call him a racist and shut down any effort to try to do what needed to be done right then to try to stop it from getting here in the first place. So, but once it was here, you have to deal with the reality on the ground. You know, he needed to be supportive to his followers that you need to do things that make sense. He couldn't have been this like, oh, masks are bad, because, well, if you're not going to have a mask, then we're going to have to do what we ended up doing, which was a massive shutdown for months on end that turned into, you know, a year and a half, more than a year and a half of rolling shutdowns and people out of work. And like, he did the right thing by putting the US government behind investment in a vaccine, but it was his own followers who were then like, oh no, we're not going to take it. So we did it to ourselves. And it's not just Trump, it's not just the Democrats, it's all of us. We did it to ourselves. And it's exactly like you said, it's because we're so busy fighting one another and trying to find fault in what the other guy's saying that we can't even see common sense when it's right in front of our face.
Yeah. Well, it's because I think also, and unfortunately, powerful economic interests have pushed this for decades. A sizable portion of our population is animated by hyper-individualism.
Mm-hmm.
And you look at the Koch brothers, you look at corporate America through so-called conservative and libertarian organizations, they pushed and pushed for decades this government is always the problem and never the solution. Yeah. And that has paralyzed strategic planning and whatever strategic plans that have been developed, even some that have developed like Trump, to lessen our dependence on Russia and China, they never fully got off the ground in a systematic way, because I would argue that our part of our population and our part of our political class is really controlled and really a captive of this hyper-individualistic, get the government off the back, drown it in the bathtub ideology. Mm-hmm. And what that has done is let the genie out of the bottle. Mm-hmm. And that's why I said in one live stream, and this pissed off this Darren Saylor guy, yeah, I'm mentioning your name, bro, motherfucker. I'm mentioning your name, and I blocked your ass because you were making nasty comments on my program, so you can't do any comments on this. But yeah, people like Darren Saylor got pissed because I was saying the ideology of Rand Paul. And there are some things I like that Rand Paul has said. But I said Rand Paul's ideology is just as toxic as the ideology of Marxism and Adolf Hitler and neo-Nazism in this country. And that totally triggered him. And I say, why? Because on the one side, you have totalitarianism that is suffocating to American liberties, and we need to stand tall against neo-Nazism, neo-fascism, and Marxism. But on the other hand, we also need to stand against ideologies that overly atomize the American people. And that's why my political ideology can summarized by, Arthur Schlesinger Jr., the famous New Deal liberal who was an advisor to JFK, John F. Kennedy. And that is that it would basically create a sense of community that doesn't suffocate the individual and create a individualism that doesn't cut the population off with a sense of community. And I think we need to, if there in the future there's a political movement, a sort of third way movement or whatever, or a third alternative, it needs to recapture this balance between individualism and community spirit. Now, one of the ways, part of this project is not only to discredit the tanky left, the Marxist-Leninists, and the extremists, the extreme left, but also my project is also to destroy the hypocrisy of the right. And what I would like to, and one of the ways, and I say this to Democrats and insurgent conservative patriots that don't like Reaganism, my strategy is simply to call them out on their hypocrisy. Oh, you're against socialism and redistribution of the wealth. Well, how come you're advocating for trade with China or trade with Russia? And an egregious example, bring it up to the election, the recent midterms. One of the things that proves my point is the race between Dr. Oz and John Fetterman. And I watched the debate between Fetterman and Dr. Oz. And when the moderator asked, what is the greatest foreign geopolitical threat? And John Fetterman, bless his heart, said after a stroke, he said China was the biggest threat. Oz, he was like, and he supposedly was on the campaign trail, was critical of China, although from what I understand, his products are made in communist China, like many other American corporations and business figures. And Dr. Oz was like, well, Joe Biden's indecisiveness and his bad decision making. And he said Iran, and he mentioned Iran as a chief geopolitical threat and that we abandon Israel and everything. And look, I mean, I am an America first guy. I'm not an Israel first guy. I don't like Israel's enemies at all. I don't. But I think Dr. Oz was trying to angle for wealthy Zionist money and support from the Israel lobby. And if you read my books, I'm not anti-Zionist. I'm not anti-Israel. I am critical of Israel for supporting its enemies in the name of business and trade and all the rest of it. But it was pretty obvious, I think he was trying to get Jewish and Zionist support by saying that, to get the neocon wing. He didn't have the fucking courage to say Russia and China. But he hears Fetterman saying China, not missing a beat. So I look at this and I say it's the same old shit. Tea Party, back to brunch, Reaganism, corporate Democrats. If they get the majority in both houses, we're going to have austerity like we wouldn't believe it. Biden's probably going to capitulate. A few good Democrats here and there will probably just be voices in the wilderness. And, we'll probably all die poor, and maybe Red Dawn will come, and this country wouldn't be able to fight off a Red Dawn despite certain advantages we have because our population is so divided. Alan Hahn, what's your opinion on the midterms and my analysis of the Fetterman-Oz thing and what happened with the midterms? Is your head spinning as badly as mine?
It was a stunning result. I think everybody was a bit surprised. I mean, on the one hand, Joe Biden had a disaster in his hands, right? It's a disaster. The economy is teetering, inflation's out of hand, and the Democrats have had 2 years to show they can do something, and they can't do anything, right? I mean, for the Democrats, it's a perfect storm. They should have lost it all, right? But the Republicans can't get out of their own way either. We keep having this same cycle is what we're getting, okay? We've got these two parties, and everyone's got to pick one. So we pick one in an election, and lo and behold, they don't do anything for the American people. So the other side's got an advantage in the next election. So what they do is they go to the extreme. The Democrats get further to the left, the Republicans get further to the right. They gerrymander the districts so they can't lose. Everything turns into a primary fight where the extremists win and the extremists get elevated. And so I think what happened is that the Republican push to the extreme right finally caught up to them. I mean, it was the Supreme Court overturning Roe v. Wade and Lindsey Graham turning around and saying, yeah, we're going to ban abortion. Like, the American people as a whole aren't looking for these extreme answers. So, yeah, the polls were showing it. You can look at the approval rating for Joe Biden. It's in the toilet. The American people want solutions, And all they're getting is this extreme division and this culture war fight that doesn't solve anything.
Right.
So, like, the Republicans have barely eked out a majority in the House. Instead of trying to rein in the causes of the inflation, they're going
What
to
are the
investigate.
causes of the inflation?
Well, I mean, you can look at any number of issues. You can look at our dependence on China that
Yes.
crippled our supply lines. So when
Mm-hmm.
China shut down, we had to shut down. So everything's still backlog shortage. You can look at a government that is printing money without any backing, without that isn't, you watch our national debt climb, that's gonna drive up inflation. More dollars in the system means more inflation. So and when they're not raising taxes to pay for that spending, it's the dollar is worth less and less every time they print a new run, right? So yes, you have the Democrats who want to spend money and the Republicans who don't want to raise taxes. So we keep racking up debt. We've allowed our supply lines to be completely dependent on our enemy, which has now bitten us hard. We didn't have masks during COVID because we were relying on China to make masks for us. I mean, like, so instead of addressing any of that, a trade imbalance that is contributing substantially to bankrupting our country as it wipes out our middle class and drives our national debt because we don't have a tax base anymore. Instead of, fixing our financial situation as a country, they're going to investigate Hunter Biden. That's what they're going to do.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
It's like,
Yes.
yes, on the one hand, the Democrats have opened Pandora's box, right? They're the ones who have declared, okay, it's open season on our political rivals, which I guess the Republicans started that too with Benghazi and Hillary Clinton. And, it goes all the way back to Bill Clinton and Monica Lewinsky. You can go back.
Even Ronald Reagan with Iran-Contra.
Right. But that's not what the American people want. It's not what the American people need. I mean, the Democrats spent every day of the last 2 years investigating January 6th and the grave threat to democracy. It hasn't boosted their poll numbers. It's just that their opponents were incompetent, right? Mm-hmm. So that's the American people. They care about how much chicken costs when they go to the grocery store. And that should have driven this election. It would have driven this election, but the Republicans drove into a ditch, So we have a divided government. So now we have 2 years of nothing as opposed to 2 years of moving in a direction, even if it's not a direction I would have chosen. But any kind of forward movement's better than nothing, right?
Well, there's no forward movement really to speak of. No, I mean, you bring up many good points. I mean, the inflation, as I see it, was spurred on by COVID. COVID revealed how dependent we are on communist China, how we're dependent on many other nations, many other countries, trade rivals, who are allies or neutrals, but trade rivals nevertheless, as well as geopolitical enemies. You have the war in Ukraine that exposed us to as well, with the Russian oil imports and fuel imports. And we did import oil and gas from Russia, particularly oil. And that cutoff harmed us. Concurrent to that was, and I don't think we should be buying Russian oil, but concurrent to that, and this is something the Republicans, by and large, many owned by big oil, including some corporate Democrats like Joe Manchin, American oil companies and many American multinational corporations that are publicly traded, despite the inflation, they were raising prices and they were making record profits and buying back more and more of their own stock. And this has been covered on certain YouTube channels of a populist left bent. And in some cases, I would look at the sources that they cited. And indeed, the populist left, people like Kyle Kulinski, as well as the bipartisan show Breaking Points with Crystal Ball and Cigar and Jetty, they've reported this. And they cite the business press, Business Insider, and other, relatively mainstream publications. And American oil companies were also, because of a bill that was passed under Obama by both houses of Congress, Republican Tea Party majority, that now they lifted the ban on exporting more oil. And to me, during the Biden administration, it's not necessarily Biden's fault per se, but American oil companies are allowed to export oil. So while we're suffering at the pump, they're exporting more and more oil, including to companies like Sinopec of China, which is a state-owned oil company. So you have massive corporate profits. And let me be very clear to the audience. I'm not against massive corporate profits, but when it's hurting the consumer and hurting American labor and hurting American national security. And it was corporate America, including ExxonMobil, to give you an example, whose chairman, Rex Tillerson, was decorated with the Order of Friendship by Russian President dictator Vladimir Putin. I mean, ExxonMobil invested heavily in Russia and Putin's KGB thug dictatorship. So, American oil companies, I mean, they really they really in part are guilty of this. And I agree with domestic energy production, but the Republicans that speak about that, they do not recognize, and I think it's because of intellectual dishonesty and campaign cash corruption.
For sure.
They don't want to put once more a partial export ban where until the entire American fuel market is satisfied, then you can export oil. They don't want to do that because, again, they're paralyzed by campaign cash, plutocratic corruption, and they're paralyzed by the ideology that serves corporate globalism, which is government is always the problem and never the solution, which they apply selectively, of course.
Well, yeah.
I mean, they want to ban gay marriage, part of the party, the GOP. And they also want to ban abortion. And I personally don't like abortion. I think it's a scourge. But as I said on a live stream, I'm not for banning it. Why? Because when you ban abortion, it doesn't address the structural causes in part of what causes people to feel they need to get an abortion. And according to studies like by the Alan Guttmacher Institute, which is pro-choice, and others, part of it since the 1980s of why people get abortion is because of economic issues, because wages haven't gone up. And then you have oops pregnancy. You have you have many employers that don't offer parental leave. You have the deunionization, which destroys union busting, which destroys the ability of the single breadwinner household, which declined starting under Ronald Reagan. Mr. Oh, I love America and number one at Morning in America. Let me tell you something. The only morning in America under Ronald Reagan is in corporate America, multinational corporations and Wall Street casino bankers. That's all there was morning in America. Because in places like Detroit, Newark, New Jersey, outside of Wall Street and parts of New York City and others, it was nothing but rubble and drug needles and rust. That was Reagan's America, and every time after Reagan America in real Mr. and Mrs. Jane and Joe America. And to be politically correct and hip with the times, we're going to throw in also Mr. and Mrs. Alvarez's and Mr. and Mrs. Wong and Chu. And I'm not saying that to be nasty because they're part of the American national community, or Hispanic and Asian and African American, Caribbean brothers and sisters. too as well. They're part of this. They're equally as screwed as the rest of us.
Absolutely.
That's why we, ladies and gentlemen, the audience, don't fall into this racial populism. That's dangerous. That's like drinking a ton of cyanide, because it will kill the soul of this country further. So you don't want that. I mean, you know, some of us have parents and grandparents that have fought against that crap in World War II. But I digress. So yeah, that's my view on the inflation, is the heightened corporate profits, and also our dependence on foreign countries and foreign governments and foreign enterprises for much of the lifeblood of this country, it seems. And the Republicans, they like to blame spending. I mean,
Yeah.
one of the things that they were talking about in the run up to the midterms was more free trade agreements. Congressman Kevin Brady was talking about that, if you recall, and working with Biden on that. They were talking about raising the retirement age of Social Security and Medicare. Rick the Dick Scott of Florida here was talking about that, and they had to backpedal it. They were talking about more deregulation. They were talking about also, check this out, Alan. Do you hear about that if you get a pension from your employer, there was a proposal by Republicans to then say you're not going to get Social Security. I kid you
No,
not.
if you have to pay into it, you get paid out of it. That's the whole
Yes.
point of the system.
But did you hear something about, didn't you hear about that?
Right? They don't. But that's the thing, right? The Republicans have been borrowing money from the Social Security fund since the 80s to pay for tax cuts, and they don't want to pay it back. So they're looking for ways to make it solvent without paying back the money they borrowed. Oh, I know exactly the game the Republicans are playing. But I mean, you hit the nail on the head, right? Like where you were talking about, we're getting into this situation where the Democrats are running this racial populism, which is, of course, resulting in a backlash where you're getting growing support for white supremacy on the right, and this tinderbox that's developing. But the problem is that the Democrats look at, okay, you look at the condition for African Americans in this country 50, 60 years after the civil rights movement, and it's not better, right? It isn't substantially better than it was in 1962, okay? But the problem isn't that, so they take that as proof that America's still racist. It's still a racist system that has to be basically burned to the ground and rebuilt. But that's not what happened. What happened is at the same time that rights were being expanded for ethnic minorities in this country, the birth and expansion of globalization that started in the 70s and the 80s started eradicating the American middle class. So the problem is that they're still in poverty, not because it's racist, but because poverty is increasing in this country because we are exporting our wealth, we are exporting our opportunities so that Wall Street and bankers and big business can get a bigger cut of the money as it goes out the door.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. I couldn't have said it better. And might I add, these white supremacist movements, I mean, I'm not trying to be picky or anything. I mean, I would not, they don't consider themselves by and large part of the right, the true white national socialists. They are, I mean, some like, oh God, what's the name? There was an article in, was it Countercurrents, I think. And then there was another individual, Richard Spencer, and they actually criticized Trump for basically the tax cuts, the deregulation and whatnot, because these are white nationalists, meaning the neo-Nazis and neo-fascists. And this is where I strongly disagree with much of the left. They represent a form of total government as well. While they'll have a private sector, it will be very much controlled and over-regulated and things of that nature. And they depart from conservatism because they feel it's basically not incorrectly, basically a tool of the rich. And of course, they lard it up with their anti-Jewish rhetoric. So they lump in that conservatism is a tool of the rich and the Jews. On this show, we oppose anti-Jewish and other prejudices against racial minorities. We do, because we know the history, all of us. We oppose that. We oppose any stultifying collectivism, of National Socialism or communism.
Right.
But a question that I grapple with, and I'm not going to lie, I've gone into some uncomfortable territory, and I've advocated some of this too as well recently. What do we do about it? Because it seems like our constitutional republic or democracy, whatever you want to call it, is seized up like a car engine that hasn't had an oil change in about 1 to 2 years. And you know what happens? The oil becomes thick and goopy. It becomes seized up, and therefore it doesn't work. It's paralyzed. Now, I'm terrified of our country dying. This country, if something doesn't happen, is going to die. That's my biggest fear. Honestly, lay it out on the table. Even if it's something controversial, lay it out. Because certain things at this point, I don't care about what I'm saying, because I have to be honest with my audience, even if they don't like what I'm going to say. And a part of my audience, as a result, a large part of them are Jeff Nyquist followers. God bless Jeff for helping me. But I have recently, in some areas, slightly upgraded my views on the functionality of the constitutional republic and democracy. What do you see as our exit ramp off this debacle? Let it out. Be honest with me. Give me your innermost thoughts.
It's so easy. It's so easy to point to the situation and say democracy has failed. It's so easy to look at Republicans blaming every time they lose on rigged elections, and so easy to look at Democrats saying, well, if you don't support us, you're a threat to democracy. It's so easy to see this and just be like, well, I guess our democracy has failed. I guess it's just, let's just hope for a military coup, toss the whole thing, and start again, right? We can't do that. We can't do that. The reality is, the United States of America is a little over 200 years old, right? We have no history. We have no nation state like Europe to say, oh, well, we're all this homogeneous ethnic group that goes back 3,000 years. We don't have any of that. All we have is this shared commitment to this constitutional idea, this we the people in order to form a more perfect union. That's all we have to tie us together. And if we throw it out the window, it's going to be like the fall of Rome. It's going to be just a fractured state of individual countries across the continent. We can't do it. So the reality is we have to fix it, because there is no other solution. There's no tossing it out, the baby with the bathwater. So, I mean, you have to look at what's causing the problems. So you can look at the elimination of the fairness doctrine in media in the 80s, which basically allowed news organizations to turn into 19th century muckrakers and driving their own ideological point. They have no need to be balanced, no need to be trustworthy. They're just trying to serve an agenda. You can look at gerrymandering. I mean, pull up on CNN the map of the U.S. House districts and look at the lines that are drawn on those districts. It's asinine, right? It's not we the people selecting our representatives. It's our representatives selecting which voters so that they can get back into Congress. I mean, Congress is a historically low approval rating forever, and yet 90% of congressmen get reelected. And it's because of gerrymandering, you know? So there are ways to fix it. Unfortunately, the Democrats and the Republicans don't necessarily have the incentive to fix it. But people like you, people like me, people like your viewers, putting pressure from below can make a change, right? You look at the history of how it is that we directly elected senators, okay? Of course, it made no sense that the senators themselves would pass a constitutional amendment that would lead to them having to go and get directly elected, right? It took state legislators running on the idea that they support electing senators to the Senate who supported this constitutional amendment to get it done. It's got to start from below. And so it just means more work on our part. As the American people, we have to demand better. And that's hard. Like, you go to work all day and you don't really want to come home and get on the internet and talk to strangers about how hard this is. But it's the only way we're going to fix it, is we have to just do the work ourselves.
Yeah, and I think we have to, I think there are several things. Now, my positions are going to be kind of controversial. I think we do need to preserve largely the spirit and the letter of our Constitution, but I think we also need to have some form of FDR's Second Bill of Rights, and make sure that it is crafted so it doesn't overly penalize business, but to make sure that also labor is given its rights to as well and codify it in the Constitution. And I also think we need to also engage in very radical anti-lobbying and campaign finance reforms. Now, the biggest impediment is the Federalist Society dominated Supreme Court. Yeah. And what I'm going to say is going to frighten you, and frighten the audience. And there is a powerful so-called conservative in Congress and both houses of Congress. They're very powerful, and they have these astroturf groups too as well. And look, again, I am very much opposed to the left, the far left. I make that very clear. But I see the people in the driver's seat, they are of the corporate right. They're the ones that have made most of the economic policies, the trade policies, and then you have the sort of McGovern wing of the Democratic Party that has put through various arms control treaties with the Russians, even starting under, of course, with Obama, with this New START treaty, to give you an example. Mm-hmm. So it's both sides. But I see the court as being a problem. I would like to see a mass movement of disaffected Republicans and Democrats and independents, or coalitions develop of honest populists and civic nationalists within the Republican and Democratic parties, form coalitions and get their own president in the White House, a new FDR, or preferably my hero is Teddy Roosevelt. He's kind of a kindred spirit because he likes the outdoors, physical exercises, and he rejects the reactionary globalist corporate right and the extreme left. The way to deal with the court and the way to deal with even elements of Congress is how FDR got through the New Deal. Andrew Jackson said to Chief Justice Marshall, granted, it was about genocide against the Cherokee Nation, which is fucked up.
Right.
But he had the right spirit. And he said, Chief Justice John Marshall made his decision. Let him enforce it. So what I would do is have both houses of Congress put through anti-lobbying bills against domestic and foreign lobbying, radical campaign finance laws. I would put in national plans to reindustrialize the United States, which is not going to happen overnight. It's going to take decades. I would launch so many reforms that in the long run will preserve the American system, but it will ensure longevity. It will be progressive yet conservative, forward-looking, but it will, in essence, be conservative because my view of conservatism, the goals of conservatism are good. Strong nuclear families, strong national security, and a competitive economy that allows social mobility to be, let some poor schmuck like me or you become bourgeoisie, essentially.
Right.
And the current iteration of conservatism that's been around really since the 1950s, but particularly of William F. Buckley Jr.'s fusionist project, which then became Reaganism, has not worked. It has failed.
Right, of course.
So what I would do is you would have to have a strong executive in Congress in this particular scenario I'm laying out that would have to do what Roosevelt says and not only bring it to the bully pulpit of the people, but threaten to pack the court and launch massive congressional investigations into these AstroTurf corporate groups, like a new House Committee on Un-American Activities, because these are un-American organizations that claim they're patriotic yet support trade with China, Russia, etc. historically. Or I would just literally draw a red line in the sand, and I would take to the airwaves, to the internet, to the TV, and I would say, let Chief Justice Roberts enforce it. And I know it's divisive. I know it is, but you have to mark it in such a way to show that these conservatives are really not conservatives. And I'm going to read to you something, because this kind of thing, to me, it's war. It's war. It's like somebody fucking with my girlfriend or my child. If somebody fucks with them to the point that they're threatening their very survival, I'm going to come out swinging. It's like a child. You're a dad, Alan, a loving father and a loving husband to your wife. How would you feel? It's like this is your baby. Your country's your baby, your child. You want to nurture it. You want to love it. You want it to grow and stuff like that and become an independent human being with good morals. I'm going to read you something. And this captures the essence of what is wrong with so-called conservatism and why it needs to be resisted. And I want to bring upon sympathetic elements of the right and the patriotic elements of the left. Because to me, the corporate right is the chief enemy. Major corporations, there are some good guys like Nick Hanauer and others that are really good. They're our allies. The elements of the rich can be our allies. It is a spiritual ideological battle. It is a battle between patriotism and nationalism versus stateless corporate greed. So let me just, let me find this here. This is very important. So this is very, very important quote here. So let me just open this up on Microsoft Word. Computer work, come on, be good to me. Okay. Okay. Okay, here we go. And this is an interview that Jeff Nyquist had on a program. He said in an April 2020 interview, Jared Nyquist, who the audience knows, been a great guest on this program, expert on Russia and China, has interviewed a number of defectors from Russia, China, Venezuela, etc. He recalled this about his employment with Newsmax back in the late 1990s, early 2000. He said, I leave Newsmax because Chris Ruddy, who was the head of it, has decided that he doesn't want to promote what I'm talking about, meaning the threat of Russia and China, despite the so-called ends of the Cold War.
Well, yeah.
And in fact, his financial backers want me to stop because I have this meeting with the main political advisor to a billionaire who tells me you have to stop promoting this book titled The Origins of the Fourth World War. Great book, by the way. Audience, you got to purchase it. Available on Amazon. Jeff Nyquist, Origins of the Fourth World War. Okay. Because I have this meeting, as Jeff said, with the main political advisor to a billionaire who tells me you have to stop promoting this book and you have to stop doing this because the financial and industrial elite will never understand this. And the only way we can defend America against its adversaries, he says, I know you're right. I'm fishing buddies with Ladislav Bittman, who worked as the communist assistant chief of the Czechoslovakian intelligence disinformation department, who defected in 1968. He says he knows the collapse of the USSR was fake. I know the collapse is fake, the main political advisors to the billionaire. But we can't convince them, meaning the billionaire, anybody, because the financial elite wants to invest in Russia and China, and they want to go everywhere. And the only way we can defend the country is we have to get ballistic missile defense, and then we're going to be good. Well, guess what? We don't have a meaningful ballistic missile defense. We have some. But this is a larger picture. It's stories like this and research that I've uncovered and people I've talked with. And then this, I am further to the left of Jeff Nyquist and other good anti-communists. Corporate America and most of conservative incorporated is the enemy. Once they are politically paralyzed and their wings are clipped, handling our extreme left opposition will be easy. We have to learn how to patriotic elements of conservatism. And patriots like us, we have to outflank the left. And the way to do it is we have to be radical reformists. We have to listen to the left extremists. We have to validate some of their grievances that we know are true.
Yeah.
And we have to steal their thunder. That's what FDR and his successors did in the Depression.
Yep.
And that bill, it was to the point where Daniel Bell, the famous sociologist, said in 1960 that the Communist Party in the United States, they didn't have a leg to stand on economically because laissez-faire capitalism was abolished.
Yep.
So what this quote with Nyquist even more significantly is saying is in my interpretation, that these billionaires know that Russia and China is the enemy. They know they're out to kill us, but they don't care.
Too much money to be made.
They're building shelters. They know it's going to go down. The poop is going to hit the fan, and they're building shelters in New Zealand and remote parts of the United States. They know. But yet, Republicans and corporate Democrats like Joe Manchin and Kristen Sinema, all they want to do is kowtow to them and kiss their asses. I'm tired of the sycophancy. This is the core of the enemy, and I can give you reams of footnotes in my books that describe this. This is the enemy we have to fight, and they're not gonna let go of their power peacefully. What we're gonna have to do, I'm not recommending violence, but what I am recommending is we have to fight fire with fire. So when I would love to see a mass movement. It might come up after a catastrophe in this country, and what could happen is then people like us need to come to the fore. And if they want to come out of their bunkers or whatever, they're going to have to play by the new rules, essentially. Or if there's a popular groundswell in peacetime, if there's an economic calamity that happens, we're going to have to basically say no to these people. Let you guys enforce it. Who and what army do you have? I'd like to see you bring a summons to the commander-in-chief who controls the troops. The Supreme Court in conservative incorporated, other than certain maybe Blackwater under the control of Betsy DeVos's brother, Eric Prince, who's a traitor, by the way. He deals with Venezuela and China and Russia. He's had some dealings on there. Are they going to fight the American army?
No,
That's what I'm talking about. And this is not an easy conclusion that I came to. I don't like centralized power, but things have gotten so far out of balance. And I know people like to talk about checks and balances, but our system of checks and balances does not adequately address the equally problematic and authoritarian hold of corporate America against the betterment of the nation. Alan Hahn, have you seen me this mad ever?
No, it's definitely new. It's definitely new, but it's understandable where it comes from. I'm going to try to take a more optimistic tone. You know, you mentioned threatening to pack the court, right? So what the problem that you're bringing up with the Supreme Court is a problem that's been faced before. And on the one hand, the Constitution was written, the checks and balances were created as a break against rapid change of any kind, right? Everything goes slow. It's why it took so long to get from the Gilded Age to the balanced capitalism of the mid-20th century, and why it took the oligarchs so long to get from the balanced capitalism to the mess we're in now, right? But when FDR came to power in the 30s and started enacting a bunch of radical changes, the first thing that his opponents did was went to the Supreme Court, who said, oh, no, you can't do this, right? It's the same problem we're going to have now. And so, yeah, he tried to pack the court, and it was, you know, it wasn't a popular thing. But at the same time, it forced the court to moderate its position, right? They knew that they couldn't continue to be an unmovable obstacle to progress, because then support for packing the court would grow. So it is possible to work with even an obstructionist court as long as it becomes clear to them that it's in their best interests to go along. Okay? So I'll be a little more optimistic that it doesn't have to be a war. It can be politics and compromise, but you aren't wrong. That they're definitely in the way. I'm just going to be a little more hopeful that there are better, easier solutions.
Well, to me, I mean, as the leaked documents in the New York Times some years ago revealed about the Federalist Society, who all the so-called quote unquote conservative, because they're really not conservative, really. They're just bitches for the oligarchs, excuse my terminology, but that's the only way I can basically cut to the point.
Yeah.
And basically all these some of the woke corporations gave to the Federalist Society, as well as the Koch brothers.
Wow. Yeah.
It is not the Federalist Society, to me, under the rubric of Constitution. They are not a legitimate organization. To me, those are not legitimate justices, despite their Juris Doctorate degrees. I am sorry. They are representing ideological, economic interests to shape the court decisions according to those corporate interests. And corporations are not doing it just because they want free speech. In some cases, they refer to this type of practice in campaign finance, for example, as investments. They're very open about that. And
yeah,
it needs to be dealt with.
Oh, for sure.
And there is American historical precedent where some American presidents, whether we liked them or not, there are things I do not like about Andrew Jackson, particularly the treatment of the American Indian nations. FDR, I mean, one of the biggest things I think sins that he did was recognize the Soviet Union under Stalin, despite the fact that Roosevelt was not a communist and towards the end of his life actually ruled the day. in trusting Stalin. He went back and forth on the issue of communism like a ricocheting bullet. But the fact of the matter is there were a lot of legitimate reforms that need to be enacted, that if the court remained the Lochner court, America would have had a revolution of a fascist or communist variety.
Right.
And then those oligarchs would have been put against the wall and shot, or put under such regulation and control under fascism that it really doesn't pay to have a totally private enterprise.
Yeah.
So, or maybe they just would have wimped out and become little bitches doing business with the communists. I mean, that happened in history too. You know, being a bunch of little unpatriotic wimps. I mean, who knows? I'm just mad about this.
I know. But the thing about the oligarchs is they're very good at short-term thinking. They're very good at saying, "Oh, well, this is what gets me the most money right now," and they fail to realize that continuing to do that's just going to lead to pitchforks, right? So that's why FDR said that, you know, what the rich didn't realize is he was their best friend. He was the one who was saving the system that let them be rich in the first place from them.
Yeah. And that's the thing. And the thing is we don't want the people who are leading the pitchforks to necessarily take power. And that's the thing.
No,
and, you know, and that's the thing. And, you know, they might be right about their grievances, but their long-term solutions are just as dangerous. Absolutely. And this is why, in order to get the country truly back to the middle and conserve the country and really put forth the best aspects of the, quote, conservative program, it's going to require, I don't want to say a war with unrestrained corporate capitalism, but I can't think of a better term. But basically, we have to come to terms with it. And to me, in this program, I think Herschel will agree, that is the existential issue facing this country. It's not LGBTQ Americans. It's not the blacks. It's not critical race theory. It's not all this stuff. It's not all this abortion. I mean, these are all problems and issues, yes, that need to be dealt with. But when I read that quote to you, bro, when I read that to you, Alan, to me, that is a more significant issue, because those private sector oligarchs hold more power and more sway over our national decision-making, court judgments, congressional legislation, and certainly the electoral process. And that's what needs to be dealt with. And I know most of the conservative viewers are going to get real butthurt about this, but it's the truth. It's the truth. And many don't want to hear it. A portion of the conservative viewers that I've networked with, a small portion of them realize this in some degree. So I'm sure I'm going to lose like probably 300 subscribers, but I got to keep it real. I got to keep it real, man.
Leadership is more than just doing what your followers want you to do. You have to try to lead them to the truth. This is why when I was looking for a solution 10, 12 years ago, I came to a third political party, right? Was that something had to break the logjam. The Republicans are controlled by the corporations. The Democrats are controlled by the corporations. So you had to, the thinking is that you had to break through in the gerrymandered districts. You had to actually, you know, in a political fight, beat this ideology, okay, this corporate rule. And, you know, you have the corporate rule with the theocrats on the right, and you have the corporate rule with the race baiters on the left. But in the end of the day, it's still the same corporate rule. And it's undermining America. It's sowing division, because the real division is the haves and have-nots. Those who have all the wealth and all the power, and the rest of us, right? We have this faux division of, you know, the culture wars and all of that. But so we have this one division that's really a threat of, if we don't do something to fix it, like you said, these extremists, either the fascists or the communists, are going to lead a revolt, and then we're all in trouble. And we also have this threat from the external with Russia and China, who have a dream of a new world order ruled by them, which is a catastrophe if there ever was one.
Unless you like gulags and labor and Laogai camps, if that's the thing.
Exactly. If you like re-education through labor camps, those are your guys. But for the rest
it just ain't my guys or your guys.
Right, exactly.
I'd be dead.
Well, no, you and I, we don't even get that choice. You're right. We've already gone on record, and there's no saving us. But yes, so the idea was point out what was wrong at home while trying to create unity by pointing out the threats from abroad. Okay, it's been tried before, it's worked before. Unfortunately, where we're at now, the third parties in general in this country are probably the weakest I've ever seen them. They're fractured, they're broken. Donald Trump's polarization undid anything anybody might have tried to do to come up the middle, because it's all just either Trump or no Trump. Even the Republicans are looking at what are they going to do if they don't run him? Is he just going to explode the party? And it's a challenging time, but America's seen challenging times before. I think the American people are strong, the American people are smart, and the American people aren't as divided as the news and the politicians would have us believe. So, I don't know if a war is the right word, but I think there's certainly an opportunity for a reformation. Not a revolution, but reforms to the system to make it work again.
And what I mean by war, by the way, let me be very clear, and the examples that I use is a verbal war, a psychological war, a war of information. That when I mean war, I'm not talking about shooting them. Now, if they summon forces that try to assassinate the leaders, then or hire private mercenaries, because the oligarchs could very well start a civil war, then that's a different story. But this is something that we need, and one of my recommendations is for people who are listening to this who agree with Alan and I know people are busy. We have our jobs, we're our families, we have hobbies. Start your own YouTube channel. You might be out there that are very many in the audience, even those that disagree with us, are very well-read people. And if you have, let's say, views that are similar to us, start a YouTube channel. Search Facebook. Start networking with people, because one of the ways forward is educational. Thank God we have freedom of speech. I have no problem with business or labor going to their congressman and meeting with them and voicing their concerns. But they should not have, through their power of their bank accounts, control that level of control of political process. Because at the end of the day, when it comes to class-based interests, I believe in balancing economic sectors. And I believe part of our political leadership should have that ingrained in their head. Not about atomistic laissez-faire liberalism, meaning the Milton Friedmans, the Ludwig von Mises, the Larry Kudlows, the Jack, Art Laffer, those type, Stephen Moore type people. Not that, but we should also reject the ideologies of the Matt Heimbachs, the Caleb Maupins, the Lyndon LaRouches. His movement is still around even though he's deceased. We should reject those both extremes. But when it comes to economics, so we have to balance those different class interests. Small business, I'm not for abolishing multinational corporations. I'm not for abolishing Wall Street. But what I am for, obviously, is disincentivizing purposeless financial speculations, derivatives, private equity. That needs to be disincentivized, or when feasible in the long run, banned. Where investment and financial investment should serve research and development and production of various types. That's where that should ultimately be served. And it all comes through incentivization. And one of the ways to get this about, again, I think we need to educate more and more Americans. It could start at the dinner table conversation at Thanksgiving tomorrow, if people get along and have respect to each other despite differences. It can come about by writing articles for Substack. It could be using the self-publishing feature at Amazon, or it could be creating a YouTube channel and having live streams. There are ways to build from the ground up. We have to try at least. I don't view myself as pessimistic. I'm normally not a pessimistic person in my everyday life. For those of you who know me personally in other venues, but I take a very coldly realistic view, and I look at the history and I interpret it as such. And sometimes it leads me to unpleasant conclusions. I used to be an economic libertarian, Alan.
I know. It's crazy.
And when I started with the National Democracy Party, I already was moving, I guess if you want to say, to the left by today's standards, without calling for the abolition of free enterprise, as I understand it, or private property. But I have become less dogmatic when it comes to ideological extremes. And
we all need to do that. That would benefit this country greatly if everybody could do that, because it's tearing us apart.
It is. And I think one of the ways that we can solve this problem is education. Now, you brought up China and Russia.
Yes.
What is your reading of the tea leaves regarding what's been going on over the past year with China and now Russia invading Ukraine? Are you rooting for Mr. Vladimir Putin?
Of course not. No, of course not.
I do rap and rhyme. I do rap and rhyme. So you're not a fan of Mr. Putin, obviously.
And I hate to say it, but every Russian that gets killed trying to conquer the Ukraine is one less we have to deal with later, right? One less that's trying to take Berlin and Paris, 10 years from now or 5 years from now or whenever they, that's what they keep saying is next stop Berlin, at least before they got stopped cold in Ukraine, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, this has been a long time coming. So you mentioned the, potentially fake end of the Soviet Union. Whether the Soviet Union fell or not, it doesn't matter. The end of the Cold War, it's like World War I and World War II, right? The Germans were stopped in World War I. Their government fell. The Germans came back 20 years later in World War II, trying to do the same thing. That's where we're at now, right? We stopped the Russians and the Chinese in 91, and now they're back, right? It's round 2. That's all it is. And I'm surprised. I think Putin's surprised too. I don't think he expected to have the problems that he had trying to go into the Ukraine. I think he didn't realize how corroded the Russian military has become and how corrupt and how everybody around him was lying to him about their capabilities. I really think he thought he was going to steamroll the place. And by all accounts, he should have, right? I mean, he should have been in Kiev in a week, and where is he now? I think it's a good thing that it failed for the West because, China was watching it very closely. They were watching the reaction of the West because the Chinese have been waiting for the opportunity to start rolling tanks and landing troops to try to expand their power and their influence by force. That's who they've always been, whether it was Tibet or Vietnam or Korea. That's always who the Chinese Communist Party has always been. They talk about how much they value peace, but really they're a violent predator state, and since free trade has emboldened them and enriched them, they are trying to modernize their military so they can kill Americans and take hegemony over the world. I mean, that's who they are. So I would hope that it means we don't have to fight a fourth world war or a third world war, whatever you want to call it, because their first step towards conquest has been stalled. I mean, it's the Korean War of the next Cold War, where, their first move was to try to conquer South Korea, and the West stood together and the West stopped them, and it failed, right? Where would it have been? Where would we have been if the communists had managed to conquer South Korea in 1950, right? But I think we're a long way away from declaring victory. And I think fixing our own house and realizing and accepting that we are in a new Cold War is the first step. We have to, there's no more decoupling. There's no more becoming less reliant. We have to just cut it off cold turkey. I mean, we cannot continue to allow ourselves to be dependent on China. Again, one of the good things that Donald Trump did do during his presidency was tell Germany, which was building these Nord Stream pipelines and increasing their dependency on Russian oil and gas, that this was a mistake, that this is suicide. The Germans took this same view of Russia that the United States took with China in 1999, which was, well, if we allow ourselves to become economically dependent on them, they will change and a war will be impossible. But when you make yourself economically dependent on an aggressive predator state, all you're doing is weakening your own ability to tell them, no, you can't just have whatever you want, okay? That it should be a wake-up call, not just for dealing with Russia, not just for cutting off the oil and the gas, which should never have been flowing in the first place. It needs to be a wake-up call for Beijing is the exact Xi is the exact same person as Putin. He may be a little more polished. He may have a little more money, thanks to the United States and permanent normal trade relations and the WTO, but he's still just a thug. And you don't trade with a thug. You don't hope that you can buy a thug off and convince him to not be a thug anymore. You just stop. Right? So I hope it's a wake-up call. It looks like it might be a wake-up call, I think, but time will tell.
Yeah, I think we have to. I agree with you. I think we have to recognize that that the Cold War never really ended. There was a book called, I believe it's called Putin's People, which discusses some of the behind the scenes of the controlled, quote, privatizations in the early stages of the Russian Federation and the latter stages of the Soviet Union. And the more the pennies go in the jar, meaning more and more evidence that accumulates that there was a repositioning of the political assets of the Communist Party of Soviet Union. They realized they needed to relabel themselves in order to survive and then expand their power again and modernize their military. In regards to Ukraine and Russia, let's see how this pans out.
Yeah.
As Dr. Peter Vincent Pry, who's a deceased CIA expert on the Soviet nuclear weapons arsenal as well as their strategies. He is a tireless voice on warning the American Congress and the presidents to put in place defenses against EMP to fortify our electrical grids, which you've not. I mean, Mitch McConnell races for these corporate-friendly Federalist Society judges, but meanwhile, anti-EMP defense is like missing in action, go figure. And the Democrats, unfortunately, they're not dealing with that either. They should have put that in Build Back Better. But obviously that wasn't on the radar of the new Mitch McConnell of the Senate, Joe Manchin and Kristen Sinema. So my point being is there needs to be a recognition that the Cold War has continued. We are in a new Cold War that really never ended. And we need to heed the words of the late Senator Scoop Jackson of Wisconsin, who was a labor-friendly Democrat who was anti-communist. Wow, what a concept!
Right?
He said in regards to national security, the best politics is no politics. Mm-hmm. We are all in this lifeboat together.
Yeah.
And we have to survive. It's like your family. You want your child to survive and become independent and moral and the best possible person they can be. And our leadership should not be about horse trading and egomaniacal driven politics. It has to be about what Jeff Nyquist correctly calls warrior aristocracy, not warriors like militaristic and belligerent, but people that are willing to fight for this country. And aristocracy in the old sense, meaning the best, brightest, and most moral, the noblesse oblige concept of an actual elite, that kind of aristocracy. Not the nouveau riche, not the multinational corporate heads like Dr. Oz and his castle in New Jersey. That's not aristocracy. You could be an aristocrat, Alan, under my scheme of leadership. Mm-hmm. You get my drift.
Yes.
And it also needs to be intellectual. You need to have a warrior intellectual aristocracy of men and women, all races, genders, whatever, that will put America first and the American people first. And one of the first and foremost responsibilities of the federal government, as stated in the preamble of the Constitution, one of the 2 or 3 things mentioned is not only domestic tranquility amongst things, but also our national defense too as well. Very important, the common defense. And this is what has to happen. We have to survive, because if America disappears as a geopolitical entity, I do believe the world will enter a new dark age, because China and Russia will fill the vacuum. I'm getting back to Dr. Peter Vincent Pry. He mentioned on a recent interview before his death that Russia is only fighting with its fingers. They have not deployed all the weapons that they could have. And they have plenty of them. Yes, there's corruption. There's maldistribution of resources. In any authoritarian central command economy, you're going to have those problems. There's no question about that. But he has the capability to destroy Ukraine and Europe.
Yeah.
And Putin has been successful through political subversion to a lesser degree in the United States, but especially in Europe.
Of course.
Putin has captured parts of the left and right in Europe, from Podemos in Spain to AfD in Germany, to Viktor Orban's Hungary, the Jobbik Party.
Yeah.
Putin, he has satellites and allies in Latin America. It looks like, Nicaragua back into the Sandinistas since 2007, Cuba since 1959, Venezuela since 1999,
Yeah.
Bolivia, the MAS party, the Bolivian Socialist Movement, has taken back power, at least in the legislature. That's Evo Morales' party. Brazil, you have Lula da Silva. I mean, I have serious problems with Jair Bolsonaro and the social liberals. He followed many of the same failed paths of American conservatism.
Yeah.
Jair Bolsonaro had some good instincts about Venezuela, Cuba, Russia, China, but he was, again, big business, and the libertarians, led by Minister of Finance, the disciple of Milton Friedman, Paulo Guedes. The same toxic elements need to be purged from conservatism. Let them go through the teabagger, libertarian, kiss the corporation's ass party. Let them form their own party. They want to talk about leave us alone. Well, I'm going to say to the Larry Kudlows and the Pat Toomey, who is out of office,
thankfully,
and the Rand Pauls and the Ted Cruzes. I mean, Ted Cruz is good on a few things, but generally not.
Yeah.
Get off our backs. Your time has long passed. You have not been good stewards of the nation. It is time for you to go bye-bye.
Yeah.
And it's also time for the extreme left not to get to the fore. It's like, just because I am attacking the corporate right does not mean I want the extreme left to take over either.
And that's the problem, is that right now those are your choices. And that's what needs to get fixed.
And a part of the Democratic Party, particularly its DSA contingent, that are in Congress, and DSA has an imprint, they're into either identity politics or, and they generally don't speak in terms of how do we build a better America. No. Despite their just criticisms of uncontrolled corporate capitalism, they don't speak of building a better America. And there is a small contingent of the anti-imperialist left in Congress, like the Tulsi Gabbards, the Barbara Lees, and others, that because they hew to this anti-imperialism, and look, I have soured over our excessive foreign interventionism in various third world countries like Libya, Iraq, and others. I generally am very cautious about interventionism, but they do it in such a way that they tend to minimize by omission or just outright statements the threats posed by Russia and China, and why Venezuela, Cuba, their allies, Iran, Syria, Burma, Vietnam, North Korea, etc., Belarus, and Europe, represent a geopolitical threat of an alliance against the West and the United States. They don't talk about that, and they don't term of building up within the continental United States in CONUS, anti-missile defense, civil defense. You don't have these anti-interventionists who sometimes will claim they're patriots, rightly or wrongly. They don't talk about really adequately defending the homeland, because they're in denial too about the threat of Russia and China, because then if they say that, then they're basically in cat's paws with the military-industrial complex. Yeah. And I have serious issues with the military-industrial complex. I mean, trillions of dollars of unaccounted money, as a recent investigation and audit of the Pentagon has shown. But the anti-imperialists, they don't want any kind of military-industrial complex, even if it was accountable and well-managed. I have no problem with the concept of a military-industrial complex. We need to defend the country. There are governments that want ill for our country. Yes. So I have to put caution against the extreme left, and that's my response to what you said.
Good.
So any concluding comments? It's been a long, but hopefully great conversation. I hope you enjoyed it, Alan, and you've been a great guest. Any comments?
Yeah, I think it's just to reiterate what you were saying, is that change is only going to be brought about by a ground up movement. So everybody who believes like we do, you can do something, right? I went onto Facebook, I started a page, we share news articles and opinions and information. You started a YouTube video subscription. Anybody can go on to Twitter, anything, just share information and help spread the word that, yes, we have these problems, but these are the solutions.
And the other thing is for those of you who are YouTubers who have a lot of experience and a lot of what is termed in the online world clout, meaning followers and respect, you need to also use your power and bring these up and comers, as long as they are credible, well spoken, they're not extremist crazies, they're not into racism or anything like that. You need to use your clout and expose these people that are up and comers who agree with you, who bring a lot of good information out there. We need to help each other. Let's say, Alan, you want to start a YouTube channel, and off the cuff, I recommend it. You're very well spoken and knowledgeable. I would have you on my show, and I would refer my viewers to subscribe to your channel. And a lot of the YouTubers who have clout, who agree with us, you need to use your clout, and you need to help your fellow YouTubers who are up and coming, because you were in that place one time when you were in the beginning. So we need to help each other. We also can't look at ourselves as just rivals. And if you want to make some money from this, as long as you do it fairly, fine. If you don't want to make money from this, fine. But we got to help each other. That's the other thing. We are a community. I can't stand Hillary Clinton in many ways, but she is right. It does take a village. It does. We are interconnected as well as we are individuals, and we have to help each other, because you know what? Those Bolshevik communists out there, as much as they're divided, in many ways they're united when it comes to taking on American imperialism, as they call it. When it comes to neo-fascists, yes, there are a lot of wars within that community, but when it comes down to taking the Jews and the rich and the non-white minorities and stuff like that, they're going to be united too as well, to take down their common hated enemy. When it comes to the private sector, plutocratic globalist oligarchs, they're united too in screwing the nation and the people. So we have to be united and helping each other too. What say you, Mr. Alan Hahn, political genius of the day? Anything else you want to add? Because I'm like pumped right now. So
it's got to be a movement. You know, the problem with Donald Trump was it was really all about Donald Trump. He had some good ideas, but none of them could be put into practice because there was nobody behind him. It's not about you. It's not about me. It's not about any of us. It's about what we have to achieve. And so, like you said, we have to build each other up and help promote each other, because it's about building a movement that will last without any one of us.
Exactly, because it's not about us as people. It's about a movement, essentially. And you know, on that note, thank you so much, Alan, for joining us. To the audience, to you and your family, Alan, happy Thanksgiving. Everyone be safe out there. Drive safely. Be responsible. You know, just make sure to be good to each other. Always follow the golden rule as best as you can. God bless our country. Let's continue to pray for our country and our people, and for the people suffering out there too as well, who are in need. And, you know, we're going to have some more interviews coming up for the rest of this month and into next month. I got some exciting guests that I'm working on, both patriotic and populist elements of the left and the right. Thank you again, Alan. And I look forward to hopefully having you again in the near future.
Sounds good.
All righty. Take care.